Greetings, everyone, and welcome to today's D-Zone webinar, It Pays to Have Swagger, Insights from the Forrester Total Economic Impact Study. My name is Faith J. Day, and I'll be your host for today's session. APIs have become strategic assets for modern organizations, powering integrations, accelerating development, and enabling new digital experiences. But as APIs become more central to how teams build software, many organizations are asking, how do you measure the value of an API-first approach? In today's session, we'll explore findings from the Forrester Total Economic Impact Study, commissioned by SmartBear, which highlights measurable outcomes for a composite organization, including 227% three-year ROI, $1.1 million in net present value, and a 7-month payback period, showing how API-first practices across design, documentation, and testing help teams move faster, increase reuse, and reduce support overhead. Now, before we get started, just a couple of quick housekeeping notes. Today's webinar is being recorded, and we'll email the on-demand recording after the session. You're also welcome to submit questions at any time using the Q&A panel, and we'll address as many as we can toward the end of the webinar. Now, I'm pleased to introduce today's speaker, Joe Joyce, Solutions Architect at SmartBear. Joe works with engineering teams to help them adopt modern API strategies using SmartBear's tooling, including Swagger. His work focuses on helping organizations implement design-first API practices, improve cross-team collaboration, and deliver APIs that are easier to build, document, and maintain. Today, Joe is going to walk us through the key findings from the Forrester Total Economic Impact Study and demonstrate how those practices highlight the research and translate it into real-world workflows using Swagger. Joe, thank you for joining us today. I'll hand it over to you to get us started.
Thank you, Faith. Pleasure to be here. Thanks for the introduction. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining. I won't tell you again who I am. You already heard that, so we'll get started. Welcome to today's session. It pays to have swagger, where we'll be talking about some lovely insights from the Forrester Total Economic Impact Study. Faith has already explained all this. Session will be recorded. Don't be shy about asking questions. Let's dive straight in, because I know we're a few minutes past the top of the hour. So I've worked for SmartBear since 2018, and my work is really pre-sale and post-sale. So I help teams evaluate Swagger as an API platform. I'll understand their requirements, what their desired business outcomes are, their current API landscape, what are they doing for design, testing, and documentation. And then if they decide to go with Swagger, then post-sale, I'll help them implement it, get the most out of it, ensure that their first 12, 18 months, 2 years of the platform deliver what they expect in terms of efficiencies. And so that's me. And we'll be looking at some of that functionality a little bit later on in the Swagger platform. But first, what I wanted to do is kind of provide the context for today's conversation. And APIs matter increasingly to the business and to engineering within an organization. So from a business perspective, why do APIs matter? Number one, they power digital products and partner ecosystems. So the partner ecosystem side of things is something I'm hearing more and more on calls with clients of SmartBears. And a lot of organizations are looking for new ways to generate revenue, right? Aren't they always? But the idea is that companies are looking at new ways of turning their existing digital assets into potential revenue streams. And partner ecosystems and digital products are two ways of doing that, right? How do we turn ourselves as a company from a product or a simple organization to a platform or to an ecosystem that other organizations want to come into and work with? And APIs are a big enabler of that. They also enable faster integration across internal systems. So a bit more on that in the next slide on engineering. They can reduce time to market for new capabilities dramatically. So if your primary products are software products or digital products, then APIs are going to encourage and speed up development within the organization, because if you have different teams that are aware of the various APIs that are available within your organization, then it's going to enable them to develop faster and bring new products to market faster as well. And all of that helps to create reusable digital platforms. So think, the likes of Stripe or Twilio, or, think of the big API hitters who have turned their APIs, into not only products, but platforms. And it can be very lucrative, right? So APIs matter for business. They also matter for engineering. Standard interfaces improve delivery quality. So if teams are speaking the same language technically, then they can communicate, services can communicate with each other more easily. Design first approaches reduce rework. I'll talk a little bit more about design first in a few minutes' time. Good documentation and tooling enable team autonomy. So team A doesn't necessarily have to have a meeting with team B to understand how to use their APIs. If they're well documented, they can read the documentation and get started very quickly. And APIs and microservices typically go hand in hand. So they support scalable, decoupled architectures. As organizations, move towards a microservices strategy, then APIs are inevitably going to play a bigger role within that organization, and their architecture is going to become more scalable and decoupled because of that. So APIs matter for business and they matter for engineering. The challenge, though, so it's not all a bed of roses. APIs, they're critical for business and engineering, but they can be hard to scale across teams. And this can be down to different teams having different approaches or standards to designing APIs, different naming conventions. Inconsistent standards then can slow down delivery. So these inconsistent standards might result in bugs or slow development cycles, while teams figure out how to kind of square the circle of team A following one set of standards for their APIs and team 2 following a completely different set. Documentation inevitably gets forgotten about. So poor or non-existent documentation will increase support burden, in both internal and external, right? So if your team has released an API and it's not well documented, and at the same time you're trying to encourage other internal teams to use it, you're going to end up spending a lot of time replying to Slacks and emails about like, hey, how does this endpoint work, or why isn't this parameter working the way that I thought it would work? And if you don't have good documentation, then that's going to make that a lot harder. All of that means that organizations often struggle to realize the full value of APIs. So I've seen this play out hundreds and hundreds of times, where if you think about the fact that Swagger is the platform that I'm trying to convince an organization of the value of, and if the organization isn't convinced of the value of APIs, then they're not going to be convinced of the value of Swagger. So they really go hand in hand. And I think it's immaturity a lot of the time, plus the usual suspects of not enough time and not enough engineering resources to dedicate to a proper API strategy. APIs are still something of an afterthought in a lot of organizations. And on the flip side, I've seen companies turn around and really focus on turning APIs into products in and of themselves, going API first, so to speak, and reaping the benefits of it. So these are the challenges. Now, before I talk about the Forrester study, just to maybe set some context that might be helpful. So Swagger is SmartBear's API platform, and it's a design, documentation, functional testing, and contract testing solution, as well as an API client. So you can do a lot with it. But many of you probably know the term Swagger, and you're probably thinking API documentation, right? So the term Swagger has been around for a very long time. At one point, many, many years ago, it was synonymous with the Open API specification. It isn't anymore, but at one point, the spec was called the Swagger spec. A lot of people still refer to it as such. But that's technically not the case. Swagger, for a very long time, has referred to the SmartBear tools that leverage the Open API specification. And there are open source Swagger tools, and the platform I'm going to be talking about today is the enterprise version of those open source tools. So Swagger, when I talk about Swagger, I'm talking about, on the one hand, our open source API tools, which would be Swagger Editor, Swagger Code Gen, and Swagger UI. So you can look them up now, and if you haven't heard of them, kind of start learning about them. And then Swagger, the Swagger products would be Swagger Studio, Swagger Portal, Swagger functional testing, and Swagger contract testing. And it's those enterprise products that the Forrester study focused on the use of. Now, we'll do more of a product kind of tooling demonstration in a little bit, but just to set the stage for what I'm talking about when I talk about Swagger in this session, so that when I'm going through the findings of the Forrester study, you maybe follow my train of thought. So the Forrester Total Economic Impact Study, as I'm sure everyone is aware, but Forrester, they're a leading global market research company. They help organizations exceed customer demands and excel with technology. So that's no mean feat. One of the services they provide is this Total Economic Impact Study, where we basically commissioned Forrester to evaluate the economic impact of SmartBear's API tools, aka Swagger, with real customers. So they interviewed a lot of real customers, and they built a composite organization model based off the real customers that they interviewed. And they did some financial modeling over a 3-year period to quantify the economic impact of having Swagger in place for these organizations. So we commissioned Forrester to do that. Probably kicked off just about a year ago. And in December 2025, the study was finished and published. And you'll be able to access a link of that a little bit later on in the session, but that is the study that we commissioned. So we'll skip straight to the good part. The key financial results of the study were that Swagger provides 227% ROI over 3 years. So that would be a return on the investment of the licensing for the tool itself. So organizations invested in the cost of the platform and the license seats for the tool, but over the course of 3 years, for things like via things like API development efficiency and reduced support burden, that investment had a 227% return, which is pretty good. That all meant that Swagger had about a $1.1 million net present value when all of those kind of costs and benefits were totted up. And it took around 7 months for the platform to essentially pay for itself. And again, like I said, that was quantified by talking to the engineers, the developers, the QAs in the organization, and seeing how much time had been freed up for them on the one hand for primary development activities and API reuse across the board. And we'll dive into the details shortly. But these are the three main headlines from the study: were 227% ROI over 3 years, a net present value for Swagger of $1.1 million, and it took around 7 months for the platform to start paying for itself. So all good stuff. Where does the value come from? 4 primary areas where the value came from. Number 1, faster API development cycles. Number 2, higher API reuse across projects. Number 3 was lower support overhead for API consumers. And number 4 was integrated API lifecycle workflows. I'll elaborate on all of those shortly, but you can see that there's top line innovation and bottom line innovation at play here, where faster API development cycles and higher API reuse means things like faster time to market. You're getting more digital products and more software products out to the market, sometimes even the APIs themselves with the product. So the APIs turning into revenue generators and faster revenue generators. But then you have kind of bottom line stuff, cost savings, lower support overhead for API consumers, and particularly in companies where the APIs were being treated as a growth mechanism and as a product or a platform in and of themselves. The potential for that overhead to grow, itself grows over time as more APIs are released, and Swagger mitigates that growth of overhead for support. So these were the 4 key areas that the value came from during the study. So benefit number 1, development efficiency. So what do we mean by that? So like I said, Swagger is really a platform. It's multiple solutions. One of them is a design solution that's called Swagger Studio. The other is, there's 2 testing solutions within Swagger: functional testing and contract testing. And then documentation would be handled by Swagger Portal. So You combine all of those modules together and you get faster API design, faster API testing, and faster API documentation. And I'll show you what all of that looks like in a couple of minutes. Then reduced rework and coordination overhead. So one of the great things about Swagger Studio is that it's a centralized repository of all of an organization's API definitions. But what you can also do is store these things called domains. And a domain is a library of reusable components that all of your API teams within the organization can pull from and leverage if they want to reuse a particular response type or a schema. And that provides the reduced rework, or some of the reduced rework and coordination overhead is, okay, we have Swagger. Now we know where all our APIs are. Now we know where all of our reusable components are. We don't have to, send 20 emails or go searching around in Confluence or Slack for, what should this schema look like, or what type of parameter should I use here in my APIs. This results in productivity gains across multiple teams. And it was the largest quantified benefit category was API development efficiency. If any of these pique your interest, like I said, at the end of today's presentation, we'll be sharing a link to the full study. There's quite a bit of reading in it. I was going to say you could use it as some bedtime reading. It'll probably be reading for multiple bedtimes because it is quite long. But that's also the strength of the study, is that there's quite a lot of detail in it, and it'll show you exactly how the numbers were crunched for all of these benefits. So the biggest quantified benefit was development efficiency. Second was API reuse. Key thing here is that reusable APIs reduce duplicate work. You'd be amazed at how much development time is wasted by teams who are re-implementing functionality that already exists somewhere within their system architecture. Right, it happens all the time, and it's I would say maybe 1 in 3 emails or discovery calls that I'm on in the early stages of a conversation with a company. A version of this, the problem statement here comes up. Right, people don't know where to go to find their APIs, which is something to do with benefit number 1. But the result of that here is, or if you didn't have Swagger in place, that would mean, okay, people are rewriting functionality that they really shouldn't have to rewrite. So reusable APIs reduce duplicate work. So that's a big benefit here. Shared standards increase consistency. One of the things I'll show you in a few minutes when I'm demoing the platform is that Swagger Studio can store a centralized repository of API standards. And I'll explain that in more detail when we're in the platform, but it just means that Swagger can automatically verify that all your APIs are adhering to certain standards. And that might be industry standards if you're in a regulated industry, or it might be, team standards if your team has a certain way of, writing APIs or transferring data or whatever the case might be. And all of that resulted in faster delivery and gained productivity. So what was that again? API reuse, big benefit. Third benefit, reduced support burden. I was going to say this one is self-explanatory, but again, you would be amazed at, like I said, I've been at SmartBear nearly 8 years, and a version of the quote, we don't have API documentation, or our API documentation is poor. People are just sharing a PDF, or it's in an email thread or something like that. So you would be amazed, and like this would be across industries, across company size, where this problem occurs. That companies who, from the outside looking in, you would think that they take APIs very seriously, and in some ways they do, but they don't yet have a consistent way of documenting them. Or they might have documentation, but the documentation is constantly getting out of date when new API versions are created, things like that. And that can just result in weak documentation. And that weak documentation increases the burden of support on those APIs. And that could be support from an actual customer support team, or it could be the support like internally, right? Developers and engineers who would probably rather be working on some other feature or some new functionality, but they're having to spend their time supporting people that couldn't figure out how to use their APIs because the documentation wasn't particularly good. So better documentation in and of itself might not always sound very exciting, but good documentation that is consistently up to date can dramatically reduce the support burden. And all of that just means people's time and expenses, right? So Definitely a big benefit here. Then there were also some soft benefits, shall we say, or unquantified benefits. So the three benefits I just mentioned were the quantified benefits or quantifiable benefits. You go beyond the numbers, then to our soft benefits, which were improved collaboration across engineering teams, stronger API governance and standards, and a better developer experience overall. And one big market for Swagger would be companies that have a developer experience team or a platform team. Increasingly what you'll find is modern organizations, when they reach a certain volume of APIs and products and market share, and if they're a software focused organization, they'll have some kind of like a platform team, or if it's really APIs in particular they're interested in, it might be an API center of excellence, or a developer experience team. And Swagger dramatically increases the quality of the developer experience because of things like the better documentation, the source of truth for your APIs. So better developer experience, improved collaboration, and stronger API governance and standards. And like the governance and standards thing is quite interesting. I was reviewing kind of my activity in Q1, right? So January, February, and March of this year. And governance is consistently coming up on on calls and in conversations. And my suspicion is what's happening there is the companies are trying to bring order to like a rapidly growing API ecosystem where, maybe the catalyst for it was maybe years ago was the rise of microservices. Okay, we're going to move to a microservices architecture. We're going to go into the cloud, and slowly but surely, their API estate grew and grew and grew. And now all of a sudden they're realizing, okay, it's out of control. We don't know how many APIs we have in production. We don't know what's internal, external. Is this documentation up to date? Is that documentation up to date? And I think that's why governance keeps coming up in conversations, where companies are trying to, control and, kind of enforce standards across all their APIs and really just get a hold of their API estate, so to speak. And regulated industries are popping up, or were popping up all over the place in the last 3 months. So companies who are operating in regulated industries increasingly wanted some kind of platform to programmatically govern their APIs, and that's one of the big things Swagger does. So key takeaways, we all love a good key takeaway. Key takeaways from the study were that API maturity drives measurable business value, standardized tooling accelerates delivery, developer experience matters for scale, and Swagger enables organizations to realize API ROI. So, like I said, these are just summary slides. The study itself is going to be shared just before the end of this session. So take a look, dive in. Forrester are very transparent about the TEI, Total Economic Impact framework. So you can actually have a look at the framework, see how they calculated it. Don't just take our word for it. Have a look at the study, and you'll see a lot of interesting stuff in there. I'll finish up the slide portion here with just some of my favorite quotes from the study. So a product owner in a financial services organization said that contract testing in the bank, and contract testing is part of the Swagger platform. Contract testing is driven by quality. By having contract testing as an investment for our squad, we could allow consumers to realize more time savings, right? And I'll dive into contract testing very, very shortly when I switch to demo mode. My second favorite quote, if I look back over the last 5 years or so, our global development efficiency has improved significantly, and Swagger has played a role in that. And that was the director of enterprise architecture at a retail organization. And finally, deep breath. Having a central repository and the ability to have asynchronous communication, everybody working off the same sheet of music, has enabled our API-first mindset and strategy. It has made us a lot more efficient. I think anybody you ask is excited. So great stuff there from the quotes. Now, drum roll, please, and it's time for the demo. So let's switch gears slightly, and hopefully everyone should see welcome to Swagger. And I usually use Zoom, and this is the point where I would ask people to send me like a little thumbs up emoji. But Faith, you can let me. I can actually see the stage here, so I know that you can see it. So no thumbs up required. So this is Swagger, all right. And like I said, Swagger. Some of you might hear Swagger and think, Swagger Editor or Swagger UI, for example. Like Swagger UI. When I say Swagger UI, I'm talking about what some of you might know as the Swagger Pet Store, right? So we do have quite a few open source tools in the Swagger ecosystem. So Swagger UI is one of them. And Swagger UI, what it does is it takes a raw, open API spec file and turns it into nice customer-facing documentation, right? And I'm sure if any of you have been working with APIs for any amount of time, you'll be familiar with this user interface. So this is Swagger UI. Then you also have Swagger Editor, and Swagger Editor is, as you would probably guess if you didn't already know, an editor for your Swagger files or your Open API files. And what that allows you to do is essentially it's kind of like a code editor for your Open API specs. So it'll tell you all about the different fields and values within your API spec file, and also render it as documentation there on the right-hand side. People will use this a lot for basic linting of an Open API definition, right? Just to double check and make sure that it's, maybe their code has generated an Open API definition. They'll pop it into Swagger Editor just to see, hey, I haven't made any syntax errors here, have I? And, if I kind of just delete some things here like a madman, we'll see a couple of errors in the editor, they can't render content, things like that. So this would be a common use case for the open source Swagger Editor. And open source Swagger UI, similarly, a lot of companies and teams would use it for kind of one-off hosting of API documentation. So what Swagger, the Swagger products here, Swagger Studio, Swagger Portal, Explore, functional testing, and contract testing, right? So these are the the kind of enterprise Swagger products, and they're all part of the Swagger platform. And I'll start with Studio because a lot of what the Forrester study found about API development efficiencies really hinges on the Studio functionality. And Studio is I feel like it's like the core of the Swagger platform. People that have been around for a while, you might remember at one stage it was called Swagger Hub. So Swagger Hub is now Swagger Studio, but the core functionality there is the same. By that, I mean, it's a central repository for all of your API definitions, right? So I've got my org here, SmartBear Bank, and these are all my API definitions, all here searchable, easy to find within Swagger Studio. So straight off the bat, when you talk to customers about Swagger Studio and, even people who are evaluating Swagger, if they come to us with a version of nobody in our organization or team knows where to find our APIs, within the first 30 seconds of sharing my screen, I can say, look, here's some value for you. Here's all of your APIs in one place, right? You can import APIs into Swagger, right? So if you have, as most teams will, they'll either have some Open API definitions floating around in the ether, or maybe some Postman collections or GraphQL or async API schemas. You can import them into Swagger Studio. You can do it through the UI. There's also a command line interface and an API that you can use to pull these resources in automatically. So you can pretty quickly do like a bulk upload of your API definitions, get them into Swagger Studio, and straight off the bat, you have improved the reusability and discoverability of APIs within your organization, right? Because now they're all in one place and we can find them. And when you open up a particular API, you can see some of the differences between Swagger Editor that I pulled up on the screen earlier and Swagger Studio. So there's a lot more buttons and options here than in Swagger Editor. So that's because you have things like, if we look at the actual API spec itself, let's call it, this is the code editor, but you also have a form editor. What this means is that a wider range of stakeholders can now take part in the API design process. So SmartBear acquired Stoplight a few years back, and Stoplight for a long time was a big competitor of ours. One of their killer features was this form editor. And I used to hate when Stoplight would come up on, on demos and calls, because they'd say, oh, we looked at Stoplight, we liked their form editor, and we have business analysts and, tech writers involved in APIs as well as developers. And what that meant was, those users, they don't want to work here directly with the raw YAML or JSON. They would like to be able to edit APIs using a, kind of fill in the form option. And for a long time, we couldn't do that. We had our code editor. At one point, we had our own form editor. But long story short, with the Stoplight acquisition a few years back, we've integrated the core Stoplight functionality into Swagger Studio, and the form editor is one of them. And what that means is collaboration improves, because now if you're a company or a team for whom APIs are not just a technical asset, they're eventually going to be some kind of product or revenue generating thing, then the ability to involve a wider breadth of stakeholders in the process, instead of it just being like, APIs are for developers, and it being difficult for BAs or tech writers or product owners to contribute. Swagger Studio helps with that a lot, and that was one of the things that Forrester found, was that the collaboration improves because of things like that. So you've got your editor there. You'll notice as well that there is a validation tab down here, and we looked at Swagger Editor in the open source a few minutes ago. And that does your, I would say your simple open API spec validation. And what I mean by that is, if you want to check to see if an API definition is valid according to the open API specification rules, you can pop it into Swagger Editor, and Swagger Editor will flag any errors that it has. Swagger Studio will do that too. But on top of that, and this is where the governance comes into play, what Swagger Studio will also do is, if you go back to my kind of dashboard view here, you'll see that there's also a governance, it's a governance tab here. And if I open that, I can see that here is where I would build my own internal governance guide. There's a list of existing rules, or I can add my own rules. And then all of those rules will be applied to all API definitions in my organization. And my organization here is SmartBear Bank. And all my APIs will be validated while I'm creating them or editing them to ensure design standards are being followed. So this is a key piece of functionality in Swagger Studio, is centralized governance. What you've got here are the out-of-the-box governance rules. So maybe I want to enforce that every API operation must have at least one 200 response, right? Or maybe I want to say that the API license must always be present and be a non-empty string. These are all things that, like, technically speaking, you could have an API spec, an open API spec file that is valid according to the spec that doesn't have these things, right? However, APIs are going to be more useful with these rules applied. I think we can all agree that, from an end user perspective, it'd be better if every operation has at least one 200 response, right? Or an API definition is more useful when it has an operation summary. This has always had implications for the human users of APIs, but it has new implications now for agentic users. And the myriad of AI-enabled use cases for APIs now mean that having rich metadata and intent information in your API spec files is more important than ever, because it's not necessarily a human, kind of looking at the spec and trying to infer what it does from the information in the file. You might now also have like agents that are programmatically, scanning your API spec and looking for, intent, and how should I use this operation, and what should I expect from the response, and things like that. So governance is useful for, the human users of your APIs, as well as these new agentic consumers. So you have public style guides as well. So I can add a public style guide, for example, the OWASP top 10, which are a set of rules to enforce security guidelines. I can create custom rules either by hand or with AI, and I can also import Spectral rules. So I mentioned the Stoplight acquisition earlier. Spectral is Stoplight's open source API linting engine, and it has its own rules format, and you can import those Spectral rules into Swagger Studio. So you've got a few comprehensive options for governance and linting within Swagger Studio. The net result of that, from a workflow perspective, is I can enable API governance for my organization. And then crucially, I can require that an API passes governance in order for it to be publishable. So this might seem like a small thing, but like we've done the market research, and not every comparable API platform has this, like your Postmans or what have you, don't all have a way to gate publishing of a non-standard API within the tool, right? So the likes of Postman and other vendors will, they'll surface API validation errors to your CI/CD pipeline, for example, and then your CI/CD pipeline blocks the publishing. Whereas you can do that directly within Swagger Studio, which prevents there's a publish step within Studio, so an API cannot be published from Studio until it's standard. All of this is just a way of gating your API workflows to ensure that any API definition that makes it from Swagger Studio into development or into production is standard, is adhering to your organizational guidelines. So if I go back to my home page now or my APIs, I'm going to see, well, actually, perhaps I need to turn on some more rules. All my APIs are compliant. If I had broken any of those rules, I would see some errors there. So let's save that. A lot of what Forrester talked about in terms of development efficiencies come from Swagger Studio, right? And that's through things like automated governance, enhanced collaboration between stakeholders. There's also a feature called auto mocking that lets you automatically create a mock server that performs like the API is going to perform based on what's described in the Open API spec. And then this is that feature I mentioned earlier called domains. So this is a library of reusable components that can be shared across the APIs within Studio, which just means that, for example, if your team or company has a specific way they want to define the money schema that, Swagger Studio can say, okay, here's what your money schema should look like within your organization. Use this. Don't write your own schema. And you can use this functionality in combination with the governance rules to say, if a user or designer tries to write their own money schema and they go rogue, an error will pop up and say, hey, don't use that. Use this. So lots of nice API development efficiencies to be gained from Swagger Studio. And I want to switch gears slightly and spend maybe 5 or so minutes just talking about contract testing specifically. One of the reasons I want to talk about contract testing specifically now is that, I crunched the numbers over the last couple of months, and contract testing is showing up in just over half of our Swagger conversations. And I suspect that's because, teams are scaling microservices. They have reached a very large scale microservice architecture, and now coordination and reliability become like critical challenges. And contract testing steps in to help with that. So contract testing in Swagger is pretty unique. Other vendors talk about contract testing, not to pick on them. Postman talk about it. Specmatic talk about contract testing. You'll see the phrase contract testing used in a lot of different contexts by a lot of different vendors. 9 times out of 10, what they're talking about is simple schema validation, right? Does this API do what the API definition for it says that it does, right? Checking to see if it's schema compliant. Don't get me wrong, which is still still a very important thing to do. But my point is that Swagger contract testing is more sophisticated than that. And it's more sophisticated because it leverages the Pact ecosystem. So Pact is an open source tool for API contract testing. It's been around for quite some time, and very wide and interesting ecosystem of tools. And in a nutshell, right, what Pact is for is addressing the issue of scaling microservices, and also running. How do you run effective integration tests for your microservices? And the typical way of doing that would be with an end-to-end test, where we deploy all of our microservices to a shared environment, and we run tests and we observe the results, which is maybe fine in certain mission critical scenarios, but you don't always get a good ROI on that type of testing as the number of services and the number of teams scales. So you're left with the problem still. How do we test our services to ensure they all have a shared understanding of each other so that we don't encounter breaking changes in production, and our support burden isn't increased, right? To link things back to the Forrester study. Contract testing also has a really dramatic positive impact on development efficiency. in particular development velocity. So I'll kind of show you an example workflow here, and that might explain a little bit about why it's an effective approach to integration testing and how it's actually faster than kind of traditional end-to-end tests. So a contract test as we do it with Pact and within Swagger looks like this. So your consumer is microservice A. Microservice A interacts with microservice B, which is your provider, right? So maybe your consumer is a web application and your provider is an API server, and consumer makes an API call to your provider and provider returns a response. So how do you test that those two components have a shared understanding of each other? Option one is the aforementioned end-to-end integration test. Doesn't scale well. Option two, the better option, is a contract test with Pact. So Pact is used to write unit tests on the consumer side, and these tests will codify the consumer's requirements of the provider. So when I as a consumer send this request, I expect this response back, that type of a syntax. When you write and run those tests as a consumer, that produces a contract, and the contract gets published to. So Pact Flow is this basically what I have on my screen here. This is Pact Flow, which is part of Swagger contract testing. And these are all applications that have had contract tests run for them and have had contracts published to Pact Flow. So here, for example, my consumer, I can take a look at its contract that it published up to Swagger, and it should give you an idea of what these tests are covering. Like a consumer contract looks like this. And, in this example, the consumer wrote a test that said, when I send a GET request to this endpoint with this type of authorization, then I expect this type of response back from the provider. And the mechanism behind the scene for that is this, right? So Swagger contract testing, or Pact Flow, lives up here at step 3. Then the provider side of the equation will retrieve the consumer contract from the broker, which is Pact Flow, and replay the consumer requests back against itself, and then publish its verification results back to the broker, which is what's happened here, right? So I've got my consumer contract, and I can see that I have verified my consumer contract against this provider. Now, this is probably feels like a bit of a dramatic gear shift from where we were a few minutes ago in Swagger Studio. And I think contract testing is the Swagger platform's secret weapon, right? Because what you've got here is a really sophisticated tool for gating. This phrase is coming in again, but gating your API releases and making sure that if you have APIs that are very frequently, aggressively versioned, and you're updating them all the time, that you want to ensure that a change in one API doesn't break any of the consumers of that API. And that's exactly what Swagger does. Swagger provides this dashboard of okay, here's all the applications in your organization, all your services, and then if you dive into any one of them, you can see the matrix, which is a fancy way of saying a table that contains all of the previously tested versions of that application against all of its integrated applications and the environments and branches that those contracts came from. So with the best will in the world, I wouldn't be able to do contract testing justice in 5 or 10 minutes. But if you're working in an environment where you're scaling microservices and therefore you're scaling APIs, where APIs are very frequently versioned, where breaking changes are not forgiven lightly, if you're trying very desperately to avoid breaking changes or production outages, I would definitely recommend taking a look at Swagger contract testing or Pact, from an open source perspective. Lots of interesting stuff there. Something to point out as well here is, I mentioned AI earlier. As a consumer of the APIs that you have in Swagger, there's also a lot of AI enabled functionality within the Swagger platform, which contributes to, what Forrester mentioned about. Actually, sorry, I tell a lie. The AI functionality actually had not been released when Forrester conducted their study. So this stuff is pretty new. And for my money, I think would actually dramatically improve a lot of the stats in the study related to anything to do with velocity or efficiency, or the speed with which you're doing API first. AI and Pact Flow and contract testing, for example, is we have an MCP server at SmartBear through which you can use, Claude Code or GitHub Copilot to do contract testing or do API design in Swagger Studio, which dramatically speeds up the process. So you have, the MCP server as a dev tool. You also have, if I jump back into Studio for a second, you have, AI functionality within the user interface. So you can generate APIs from a prompt, generate APIs from code. So if you have like a code snippet and you want to document that API, you can drop that in here and AI will, generate your API definition for you. So the term design first is mentioned quite a lot in the Forrester study, and this would be an approach to API development where the API spec or the API design is, the first thing that the team works on. So we either write or generate the API document, the API design, the open API, that might be open API or it might be async API. That's another spec that Swagger supports. And then everything else kind of comes off of the API definition, right? So you start with your API definition file. This is a component. You start with your API definition file, and from that you might generate service stubs. You might generate tests, using contract testing, for example. My point there is that that's design first. There's also code first. A lot of companies will come to us and say, yeah, we want to do design first, but we do also have a lot of APIs that are code first, as in, the APIs are already live out there in production, but we don't have them documented with Open API. And Swagger can help both of those scenarios using, generate from prompt and generate from code, respectively. So we've talked about 2 of the 3 benefits around API development efficiencies, which are achieved through Studio and also contract testing. And we've talked about API reusability as it is achieved through Studio and through contract testing. We also have that third benefit of reduced support burden, which hinged a lot around the API documentation side of things, right? So having good, up-to-date API documentation will reduce the burden of support on those APIs. When it comes to Swagger, that is done through Portal, right? So we've talked about Studio, we've talked about contract testing. I want to talk about Portal now. And you can think of Portal as your shop front for your APIs. So particularly if you're a company that is going to eventually productize your APIs, you're trying to encourage third parties to use them, then Portal is very useful. Okay, so what I'm going to do is close contract testing. I'm going to move Studio over here to the left so that I can illustrate the workflow. So Studio is, you could think of it almost as your back-end environment for developing your APIs in an API-first manner. So you write the API spec or generate from code, you sync it to GitHub using the native integration, your developers build the API, you test it using contract testing, or Swagger functional testing is another module I haven't mentioned yet. Then API is developed. Okay, what do we do next? Now we want to deploy it, we want people to use it, and that's where Portal comes in, right? This view that I'm looking at here, think of it as your Portal admin view. This is where you set up your Portal. And the end result, if I click on Portal Live View, is something like this, right? So I've got my SmartBear API portal for my SmartBear bank, and I've got a couple of different products here available. Payments operations. Let me open that up and see what's there. I can see my API definition. Great, Swagger UI. Oh, here's how I use it. Here's how I get started. Not much here, but in my AI generated version, there's quite a bit more, and I'll explain that in a second. One of the questions that I will ask, any, API engineer or developer or, QA manager, product manager, whoever we're talking to in an early call, I'll ask them, are your APIs internal or external? Are they public or private, right? Are your APIs just used by your internal dev teams, or are there any APIs that you publicly expose? Most people will say it's a bit of both. But if the priority is the public facing or external APIs, that's where Portal becomes quite useful. And what you do holistically is you create the API in Swagger Studio and you link it to a product in Portal. All right, so you can see here there's a button here for linking APIs, and if you have an API in Studio that has multiple versions, you can link particular versions of the API to Portal. with an end goal of publishing that API in a public portal so that people can come here, open up the product, view the API, and if it's public, just start using it straight away. Or maybe they need to request access. I'm logged into portal right now. If I was logged out and these were private products, there'd be a little access button here, and a consumer would have to click on it, and then whoever is the admin on the Swagger side would have to let them in. Essentially, there's an access requests and role management functionality here in the admin view. Now, so this part of Swagger, like I said, heavily relates to the part of the Forrester study we looked at around support burden. And it also relates to reusability as well. One of the companies that I'm talking to at the moment, they already offer APIs to their partners, right? So they refer to their situation as like a partner network, but the partners are essentially customers of theirs, right? They're paying for access to their APIs. So they already offer their APIs to some of their larger partners. What they want to do for growth is to start offering APIs to some of their smaller partners as well. The challenge for them is that the way that they support their existing big partners is very manual, hand-holding. If they need to rotate an API key or request help, it's an email directly to the DevOps team, and that won't scale. So they would like an API portal to make it easier for these smaller vendors and smaller partners to DIY onboarding to their APIs, basically. And that would be done through the pages of documentation that they can add to the portal, and then access to the API documentation itself. So API documentation, like I said, sometimes gets a bad rap as not being particularly thrilling or important, but it can genuinely be a key part of your growth strategy if you're trying to, incentivize and encourage vendors and other, parties to start using your APIs more. I have one eye on the top left corner of my screen. We are just under 5 minutes left in the session. So what I want to do is kind of wrap up the demo portion here. I'll jump back up to my Swagger home. So we're zooming back out. We're back in the room. What we looked at there specifically was Swagger Studio, Swagger Portal, and Swagger Contract Testing, and how they positively impact API development efficiency, API reusability, and reducing the burden of support on APIs. There is also a Swagger Explorer, which is an API client, and Swagger Functional Testing, which is a functional testing tool, which we won't have time to dive into today, but bear in mind they're there as well, and they were included in the Forrester study. So what I'm thinking, Faith, is it might be a good idea to see if anyone has any burning questions.
Perfect. Thank you, Joe, for walking us through the study and giving us a demonstration of how the API workflows work with Swagger. And so we're going to look to see if there are any questions. And as a reminder, if you have a question, please submit it in the Q&A, but it looks like we have one right here. And so first question, for teams currently doing API development in a code-first way, what's the recommended path to transition to design first with Swagger?
That's a great question and timely. So the quickest path, right? Like if you wanted to move one API to a design first workflow now, would be to jump into Swagger Studio and basically generate your API definition from code. So you can add basically code snippets of your existing application. You can add a prompt to add some context, give the API a name, put it in a project, and then what Swagger Studio will do is generate an API definition for you for that, for the application that you specified. And that's something that could take minutes, right? So with 5 and 10 minutes and you've gone from a code first API to now you have an API definition for that service that you can use to, number one, check and see if it's adhering to your organizational standards using the governance functionality. You can take that definition, you can start generating some contract tests from it or some functional tests from it. You can put it into Portal, you can document it publicly. And then, if you're feeling brave, then you can basically use that API definition and then create a new version of it, because you can version in Swagger Studio, create a new version, and the next time you're adding new functionality to that API, you do API first, right? And that's what I've done that with teams many, many times, where they pick a already existing application, generate Swagger from it, and the next time they are adding functionality, they start with the API design. So that would be the quickest way to go from code first to API first today, if you wanted to.
Awesome, thanks. And we have another one, a bit about the study. You mentioned 30% API reuse by year 3. What Swagger features or best practices help organizations achieve this?
Great question. And for my money, an underrated approach, and it's probably underutilized because I don't think we explicitly call it out in our documentation, and I think we should, but because we're combining two features, really. We're combining, we're positively impacting reusability by combining that domain functionality I mentioned earlier, which you can think of it as a library of reusable components for your APIs, right? So that's feature number one. You can combine that with a rule in the governance tab that enforces the use of these components, right? And what that means is that Swagger Studio is going to flag to a user if they've tried to build from scratch something that already exists. So to me, that's a very powerful way of promoting API reuse at the component level, and then kind of at the API level, the best way to do it would be through collaboration, right? Get people into the platform, right? So if you have an API, if you're the designer of an API, there's a share and collaborate button up here, and anyone who you think is going to need it, get them in here, right? Invite them to collaborate on the API, and they're going to get email notifications when there's new versions or major changes to the API spec. So those would be two recommendations in the short term to start to try and get to that 30% API reuse.
Great recommendations. And I think it's all the time we have for questions today. Thanks again, Joe, for sharing the research insights and the examples of how API first practices can actually improve development efficiency, collaboration, and API reuse across teams. So for any organizations that are looking to monetize their API strategy, it's clear that design first workflows, better documentation, and earlier testing can drive meaningful technical and business outcomes. But as we can move into the close, Joe, I'm going to hand it back to you to share how attendees can actually learn more about SmartBear and continue this conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Faith. Very much appreciate your time and help with today's session. So I've just pulled up on the screen there, and I think you should all be able to see it. Just a link to read the report. So the study that I have been enthusiastically quoting for the last 45 or 50 minutes. So if you'd like to take a look at that in a bit more detail, you will see a link there to a page. I'm going to share my screen one more time and just show everyone what I'm talking about, where you will see some of the high-level highlights that I've already described, and you'll also be able to kind of dive into the actual report itself. And if you feel like it, if I have made a very convincing argument for API first with Swagger, once you get to this page, there is a little form down here where if you want, fill it in, and you might, if you're not entirely sick of hearing me talk by now, you might end up talking to me again about your specific setup or infrastructure, or maybe you're having challenges with breaking changes of APIs or API discoverability, and you can get in touch with us there as well. So click that link if any of that sounds interesting. I think, Faith, unless I'm mistaken, that is everything.
That is everything. Thanks for sharing your report. Thanks to everybody who joined us today. And of course, keep an eye on your inbox for the on-demand recording. And we hope to see you at a future DZone webinar.